Good morning. I'm going to carry on my studies about the history of the Church of England. So this one is going to take things into the 19th century. I'm not quite sure how far we're going to get in this video. So in the last video, we talked a lot about the evangelical party in the Church of England and the revival of evangelical faith that took place in the 18th century. One of the things I didn't touch on in that video was evangelical social action. So you'll often find evangelicals very quick to boast about the history of social activism that they have. So they will mention the abolishment of slavery in the 18th century. You might have heard of John Newton, that famous slave trader who was converted and became a clergyman, who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace. He was a slave trader who he had an evangelical conversion, and after that, at some point, he became involved in the movement to abolish slavery. Of course, he didn't give up being a slave trader immediately after he was converted to evangelical Christianity. There was, I think, a bit of a gap between those two events. But he did become thoroughly committed to the cause of abolishing slavery. And he was associated with another Anglican clergyman, William Wilberforce, who was very active and influential in the movement to abolish slavery. Moving into the 19th century, you can also talk about Lord Shaftesbury, an evangelical peer in the House of Lords, who was very prominent in crusading for better rights for workers, for the ending of child labour. He was very active in supporting a lot of charitable concerns that worked amongst the poor, improving the conditions in the London slums. And there were other evangelicals who were also involved in both political social activism and charitable work amongst the poor and needy of England. On the other hand, we mustn't give too much credit to evangelicals for some of those things. There were a lot of evangelicals who were very conservative and who were very much supporters of laissez-faire economics, who were somewhat hostile to any kind of movement towards social justice. So we can praise evangelicals in the 18th and 19th century for some things. We can also maybe blame them for others. Right, but I'm not going to spend too long talking about that. So we're coming to the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. One of the things about this period of time was it was a time of revolution and change. So you had the French Revolution, you had the American War of Independence, you had many other revolutions taking place on the European continent. So it was a time of upheaval and uncertainty. And one of the impacts of that was an increased interest amongst particularly evangelicals in the prophecies of the Bible and eschatology, what's going to happen when the Lord Jesus Christ comes back. I mentioned in a previous video about how a lot of Anglican priests didn't have an awful lot to do. Their duties were very light. And so they'd spend a lot of their time collecting butterflies or getting involved in other areas of scientific research. And a lot of our knowledge of biology has been advanced considerably by some of those men. But what some of these Anglican clergymen with lots of time on their hands put that time into studying the Bible and studying the prophecies of the Bible and coming up with some really complex and interesting theories about the Lord's coming, his second coming in the future. Some of these men held the traditional Protestant historicist view that the events of prophecy in the book of Revelation are fulfilled throughout history, so that you can see specific events that are tied in the book of Revelation, symbolically fulfilled at particular points in history. Those who took that view would have tended to see the papacy, the Catholic Church, as being the Antichrist. And many of these people in the early 19th century who were very interested in prophecy took that view. Others began to take an interest in what might be called the futurist view. This was the view that the events of the book of Revelation are primarily fulfilled in the future, that there's going to be a period of upheaval in the world, or tribulation, and these things haven't happened yet, but they're going to happen. So, as I said, traditionally, Protestants have tended to see the Antichrist as being the papacy. But then there's this chap who turned up in Europe at this time, Napoleon Bonaparte, this incredible man who was able to dominate about half the world. He rose from almost nowhere, out of obscurity, into becoming a powerful dictator, to becoming a man who could conquer nations, and came very close to becoming the ruler of the entire world. And he was very much, while he tried to get on with the Catholic Church, he was somebody who was generally on the secular side of things and somewhat hostile to traditional Christianity. So you can see how people studying Bible prophecy might have seen this figure, Napoleon, and thought, oh, goodness me, maybe he's the Antichrist, or maybe somebody like Napoleon is going to be the Antichrist. And so there's a kind of a shift amongst some of these evangelicals in moving away from seeing the papacy as the Antichrist, and instead expecting a kind of a secular figure, an amazing charismatic dictator emerging. And that's probably the dominant view amongst Christian fundamentalists today, and evangelical Christians who are interested in Bible prophecy. And along with this interest in prophecy was a belief that Jesus Christ is going to come back and establish a 1,000-year reign over the earth. This was the view that was taken by some of the early church fathers, but most Christians had abandoned it. They believed that the 1,000-year reign that's spoken of in Revelation chapter 20 is fulfilled symbolically, that it represents the entire reign of God throughout history. Some of them were what you might call post-millennial. They thought perhaps the gospel would have an influence over the entire world, and the world would be increasingly Christianized through the spread of the gospel. That was what some Protestants held. But now there was a return to this ancient idea of a literal 1,000-year reign when Jesus Christ comes back. And many evangelicals were very enthusiastic about that idea. Not all of them, of course. Some of them held on to the post-millennial idea that the 1,000-year reign would come about through the preaching of the gospel, and others held to the more traditional view that the entire period of church history was the millennium. But there was this increasingly popular idea of millennialism coming in. And I think a lot of it had to do with the uncertainty of the times, the revolutions, the rise of Napoleon, social unrest in Britain. And as I said, plenty of people in the Church of England were quite interested in these ideas. In the 19th century, you got a movement called the Plymouth Brethren, a breakaway group, a Protestant sect who wanted to meet simply without the kind of structures of the church. Some of those men were from the Anglican Church, from the Church of England or the Church of Ireland. Others were nonconformists, like Baptists or Congregationalists who'd decided that they felt that they didn't like the idea of all these denominations and wanted to kind of meet a bit more simply without church structures. One of the prominent figures in this movement was John Nelson Darby, and it's him that I did my PhD thesis about. I did a study on his ideas about the church. And this is why I suppose I'm so interested and knowledgeable about the Church of England in this period of time, because I did my PhD thesis on it. So John Nelson Darby, he was very much into the idea of premillennialism, that Christ would come back and establish a 1,000-year reign. He also He also believed that there would be a future Antichrist, although he also felt that the Catholic Church was also an evil institution, and very much had a part to play within Bible prophecy. And he got involved with these Brethren people after leaving the Church of Ireland. He was from Ireland. I don't think he ever actually resigned his priestly ordination. He could have gone back to the Church of Ireland at any time if he'd affirmed his belief in the 39 Articles of the Church of England, but he pretty much left the Church of England or Church of Ireland and considered the Anglican Church to have gone off the rails and was no longer following the right path. One of his other ideas was that Christ would come before this period of time, this period of tribulation before the Antichrist, what's come to be known as the rapture doctrine, which is very popular amongst evangelical fundamentalists, particularly in America, the idea that Christ will come suddenly at any moment and then take away all the Christians from the world and bring them to heaven. And then the world will then fall into chaos as God pours out his judgment and the Antichrist arises and terrible things happen on the earth. It's quite interesting how his ideas spread in America. So I'm going off the topic a bit and talking about the Brethren and Bible prophecy and American fundamentalism here. But I did my thesis on this stuff, so I kind of feel like I have to mention it. So he made several tours of America, the United States, and Canada as well, with the intention of spreading the Plymouth Brethren and his own way of doing church. On the whole, Americans didn't seem to be terribly interested in that. They didn't really want to leave their denominations. They were quite happy being Baptists or being Methodists or being Presbyterians. They didn't really want to join the Brethren. But they're very interested in what Darby had to say, particularly his ideas about the millennium, about the rapture, about the Antichrist. And those ideas kind of had some resonance in America. And when the American fundamentalist movement emerged, they very much went on board with this stuff from the Brethren and from John Nelson Darby. And they adopted it wholesale. Prior to Darby's coming to America, premillennialism was not terribly common in the United States. On the whole, that Americans preferred the optimistic view that the gospel is going to spread through the world and the kingdom of God is going to be established through the spread of Christianity. The idea that Christ is going to come back with judgment and establish a literal 1,000-year reign, that was an idea that really came in with the emergence of American fundamentalism. Anyway, we probably ought to get back to England and what's going on here. So there's various developments at the beginning of the 19th century which have a huge impact on the status of the Church of England. So one of these things is the emancipation of Catholics. So in 1829, the Catholic Church is legalized effectively, and it's no longer illegal for the Catholic priests to minister in the country. It's no longer illegal for there to be Catholic bishops. Prior to that, there was terrible persecution of Catholic priests who were operating within England and Ireland. That persecution kind of lessened a little bit as we come into the 18th and 19th centuries, but it's still there. The government was still hostile to Catholicism. But with the emancipation of Catholics in 1829, there were legal Catholic churches in the country. And that would have a huge impact as some people in the Church of England began to think, oh, maybe we need to move over to the Catholic Church. Maybe the Church of England is not going in the right direction. Maybe we need to become Catholics. And we'll talk about one of the more prominent people in that category soon. Also, you have the end of persecution towards nonconformists, those denominations that are separate from the Church of England. So in 1828, Temporalities and Corporations Acts were repealed by Parliament. Now, the nonconformist churches were not persecuted in the same way as Catholics. They were allowed to operate, and you could get a license to become a nonconformist preacher. But effectively, nonconformists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Quakers, they were second-class citizens. They weren't allowed to be members of Parliament. They weren't allowed to go to Oxford or Cambridge University. They were kept on the margins of society, even though there were quite a lot of them. With 1828, these rules were abolished. One of the most irritating rules for nonconformists was that they had to get married in the Church of England. They weren't able to hold weddings in their own Protestant sects. You couldn't have a Baptist wedding or a Presbyterian wedding or a Quaker wedding. You had to go to the Church of England, and that was irritating for the nonconformists who had to go to the Church of England. It was kind of a bit irritating for the Anglican priests who had to minister for such weddings. So that was brought to an end in 1828. So these two events, the legalization of Catholicism, the putting of the nonconformists on an almost equal standing to Anglicans, they kind of raised questions about what was the role of the Church of England within the nation. Did the Church of England now have the same status as it had had previously? So that was all sorts of questions raised by that. And so people began to ask about the questions of what does it mean to be an Anglican? That was a question people hadn't perhaps thought about very much before. Prior to that, Anglicanism was basically the official Protestant denomination within England. It was the established church. But now that you've got legalized competition with the Church of England, Catholics, nonconformists, then what does it actually mean to be of your own choice an Anglican? What is the Anglican Church all about? And the evangelicals, their answer to that was, well, it doesn't really matter too much. As long as we're preaching God's word, as long as we're preaching Jesus Christ, it doesn't particularly matter. But we quite like being part of the established Church of England, so let's carry on with that. But we're quite happy to be friends with the Baptists, with the Methodists, with the Presbyterians. Let's all get on well and focus on Jesus Christ. That's the main thing. That was the evangelical answer. And you can see that in the way that evangelical Anglicans were happy to work with Baptists and Congregationalists and Methodists in charitable work, with mission work, with making Bibles available to people in other countries through the British and Foreign Bible Society. The kind of liberal, the moderate answer was, well, yeah, you evangelicals are right. It doesn't really matter too much, but this is the established Church of England, and we're very happy to be Anglican too. What matters is being sincere and keeping to traditional Christian morality. It doesn't matter too much what you believe, but it's quite handy being part of the established church. That was the kind of liberal, moderate answer. But we began to see another answer coming in Anglo-Catholicism. So people who came from the high church party within the Church of England began to say, well, there is more to it than that. There is something special about being an Anglican. We've got a particular identity. So we've got our own liturgy. We've got the Book of Common Prayer, which has taken some elements from the kind of medieval Catholic Church. We've got bishops, so we've got the similar structures to the Catholic Church, but we're still a Protestant denomination. We're still separate. But gradually, some of these people began to kind of question the Protestant bit and saying, well, we're not really Protestant. We're something completely different. We're something special. And these men began to look to the early church fathers of the way things were in the early medieval church. They began to think, well, what was going on before the Reformation that was so special? Is it possible that maybe we lost something when the Catholic Church went bad in the Middle Ages, but maybe there was something that we've lost with the Reformation and some of the things that have been taken out. Maybe we need to have a look back at the past. That was the kind of ethos of the Anglo-Catholic quest for an Anglican identity. And one of the things that spurred that and gave a life to these questions about the identity of Anglicanism was the daughter churches of the Church of England. So obviously we've got the Church of Ireland in Ireland, which was an established church, which was following the same structures as the Church of England and was established and run by the state. In Scotland, things are a bit different because after the Glorious Revolution, the British government had given official recognition to the Presbyterian Church within Scotland. There was no longer any desire to impose Anglicanism on Scotland. As we said in I think it was the second video we made, Charles I had tried to impose the Book of Common Prayer and bishops and all things Anglican on the Church of Scotland, and it had led to a war and rebellion. And it was a complete disaster. So the British learned from their mistake, and after the Glorious Revolution, the Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian Church, was the established church in Scotland. However, there were people in Scotland who did like the Anglican way of doing things. They liked the Book of Common Prayer. They thought it was a good idea to have bishops, and so they'd formed the Episcopal Church of Scotland, which was basically an Anglicanism within Scotland. It wasn't an established church, it was effectively a non-conformist denomination that was operating without the assistance of the state, but still recognisably Anglican. So these people saw something valuable in being Anglican without being part of the establishment. Likewise, in America, when the American colonies were under the rule of the British Crown, there were people who went there, some of whom were of quite a high church leaning, who settled particularly in the South, in Florida, in Virginia, in the Carolinas. Anglican churches were established, which were, before the American War of Independence, were part of the Church of England, but over in America. And after the American War of Independence, these people were still there. There were still these Anglican leftovers, particularly in the south of the United States. Because they weren't effectively the Church of England anymore, and because they were looked on with suspicion by the revolutionary Americans. Of course, it was the 4th of July only a couple of days ago, so we were all thinking about the American War of Independence and America. Well, these people, they thought, well, we're going to have to be American now because America's an independent country. We can't carry on being the Church of England. We can't carry on being a leftover of the crown here. And so they called themselves the Episcopal Church, but not just that, they were the Protestant Episcopal Church, because they wanted to be respected by other Christians in America as being Protestants and being not some weird thing that was too close to Catholicism. And so you had the birth of this daughter church of the Church of England, the Episcopal Church in the United States, which was effectively following Anglicanism without being part of the Church of England. So now there's a kind of a distinct Anglican identity emerging, which is completely separate from the kind of links with the established church, with the British state. These are really new things, and they are, as I say, leading to questions about what it means to be an Anglican. So the really crucial movement in this time was the Oxford movement. So this was kicked off by the Temporalities Act of 1833. So in 1833, there were some changes to the Church of Ireland, a huge restructuring and the abolishment of several bishoprics. So in Ireland, Ireland was predominantly Catholic. Most of the population were Catholics, and they were terribly persecuted. They were effectively second-class citizens within their own country. Protestants were in charge, and the Catholic majority were right at the bottom of the heap. They were effectively peasants with little political influence. And they were burdened not only with having to pay taxes to the British state, but they also had to pay taxes to the official Church of Ireland, which was a Protestant body that they had no liking for and no interest in, but they were having to pay taxes to support it. And this was a huge burden. So the Temporalities Act of 1833 reduced some of that burden by reducing the number of bishops in the Church of Ireland. So that meant that the Church of Ireland wasn't so expensive, so much of a burden to be borne by the Irish taxpayer. But this raised questions in the minds of some people. Some people thought, well, bishops are a sacred institution. This is something hugely important, our Church of Ireland. You can't go messing about with it. You can't go restructuring it. What authority has the British Parliament got to mess about with the Church of Ireland, which is the body of Christ? It's a church. It's a holy thing. And one of the people who was outraged by this was a chap called John Keble, and he effectively began the Oxford movement by preaching a sermon on the Assize Sunday, when the Assizes were when the magistrates came into town to take up various court cases. It was a very important day because there'd be lots of people in town, and he preached a sermon on that day that was inspired by this Temporalities Act that had been passed that so outraged him. And a lot of people went along on board with him and said, John Keble's absolutely right. The government shouldn't be messing about with the Church of Ireland. The church is a sacred body. So there, what you're getting is a kind of a tension between the idea of the Church of England as a sacred institution and its role as an official political body, an arm of the British civil service under the control of Parliament. This movement is called the Oxford movement, mainly because a lot of the people involved had been students at Oxford University. And most of those who got involved were high church men, although some of them were evangelicals who'd shifted in their thinking towards the high church theology. And they became known for their opposition to some of the secularizing tendencies in the Church of England. They were opposed to excessive state control of the church. They recognised that it was right and proper for the Church of England to be part of the state, to be subject to the crown, but they didn't like Parliament messing about with the Church of England. And they wanted to assert the sacred character of the Church of England. Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that in the next video, because we've gone on for nearly half an hour now, and the Oxford movement is a huge subject. So to summarise what we've talked about in this video, we've said a little bit about evangelical social action. We talked a little bit about a burgeoning interest in Bible prophecy, particularly amongst evangelicals, and how that still has an influence in our time through the influence that these evangelicals have had, particularly on American fundamentalism. We've talked about some of the changes at the dawn of the 19th century with Revolution, Napoleon. We talked about how the status and place of the Church of England was changing because of the end of the persecution of Catholics and nonconformists, and also how the question of what Anglicanism is started to become a crucial question. Okay. Thank you ever so much for listening to me. I promise I'll try and make a new video about this as soon as possible. I think this Oxford movement subject is so huge that we need a separate video on it. Okay, bye-bye. See you next time.